Well, now it's time for our fourth and final presentation, and it comes from McKinsey & Company's supply chain specialist, Adrian Viellechner. Now, I'm sure you'll all agree that today we face increasing supply chain risk from more frequently occurring shocks and more vulnerability, causing significant economic damage. Building resilience in global supply chains is key to decrease supply chain risk, resulting in lower cost, reduced lead times, and unlocked cash flow. So what does this mean for the future? Well, I'm delighted to say that Adrian is here with us in our studio in Calcutta to tell us more. Adrian, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you very much for the introduction and also the invitation. I'm very glad and excited to be here. To give you a speech on resilience in global supply chains from our perspective from consultancy from McKinsey & Company. Thank you very much for the introduction. Maybe a couple of brief words about myself before joining into the presentation. My name is Adrian Viellechner. I'm a supply chain specialist at McKinsey & Company. I joined the company about 6.5 years ago. My background is business and mechanical engineering. And since I joined the company, I've always focused on the topics of supply chain management, logistics, transportation. And within supply chain, I've always focused on physical flow topics as well as information flow topics. I've gathered experience in a couple of industries. I tried to be broad on the industries, experienced very interesting projects in consumer goods, retail, basic materials, chemicals, agriculture, nowadays medical products as well. Very interesting fields for supply chains currently in the current times after the pandemic. My focus for this presentation is, as Sam was introducing already, is have a closer look on resilience in global supply chains. And first, getting the basics right, understanding the facts, providing a little bit more color to the fact base, and then, of course, tackling the question of how resilience in global supply chain can actually be increased. Maybe you help me switching the slides one further, then I can continue. Perfect, thank you very much. Just as a quick recap, before I share with you my agenda and share with you the deep dives I prepared for today, which I would like to share with you, let's take a quick recap of actually where we're coming from. After COVID-19 emerged about 1.5 years ago, we could see some significant shortages happening in the world. And some of the interesting examples were there were even shortages of containers for Chinese exporters trying to export their goods into the world. We had a significant scarcity of rubber, which of course then tackled OEMs and their suppliers in producing tires. We had just quite recently quite significant shortages when it comes to semiconductors and chip production, which is now heavily increasing the lead times for OEMs. And even when it came to steel shortages across the EU, that was also quite dramatic and critical piece. So we had a quite significant shortages, and of course in the past we've always tried to increase efficiency, but might have overlooked a bit of the piece of resilience. And that should have changed, but let's figure out if that happened. So my agenda for today, what I've prepared is that I first would like to come back together with you and check the fact base. So what are we actually talking about when it comes to supply chain risk? And what is the associated cost to it? It's not just the terminology. Why should we care about supply chain risk? Because there's a significant impact, a significant cost associated to it. As a second then point, I would like to really deep dive into what can we actually do about it? What measures and actions can we take in order to increase resilience in global supply chains? And I would like to finish off by just providing you with a couple of client examples, sanitized client examples, where I would like to show you how we actually did it together with our clients. When we talk about supply chain risk, let's get that first of all right, that we have a common understanding, at least from our perspective, how we see the definition of supply chain risk. In our understanding, it is the product of shock and vulnerability. When we talk about shock, that is the unexpected event basically happening and threatening the supply chain. And these shocks can be defined or categorized along two dimensions: magnitude of shock, as well as ability to anticipate. So we are here at the left-hand side, where we say these are the four categories then emerging from the two dimensions: magnitude of shock and ability to anticipate. So let's start with a high magnitude of shock. There's then surprise catastrophes, and here one prominent example is probably the COVID-19 pandemic. And then there's also anticipable global crisis. And there you could mention economic crisis, financial crisis. You might wonder, is that even anticipable? To some extent it is. There are macroeconomic indicators, which, for example, the Purchasing Managers Index, just to name one, which gives you an indication where the economy is going. And then if we have a look at the lower magnitude of shock, then we talk about surprise disruptions and anticipable disruptions. For surprise disruption, an example could be supplier bankruptcy, right? So it is impacting you, depending on the scale, of course, to what extent you're working together with that supplier, but is not an economic crisis. And then there's anticipable disruptions, for example, changes in regulations or local military conflicts. So along these two dimensions, it helps maybe to better understand what shocks exist. And then if we go to that part, the right part, this is then what happens if the shock comes in? How vulnerable are you to that shock? And that, of course, then depends on the attributes and approaches that you have taken in order to prepare for these shocks. So this is then, of course, where you should, as a supply chain manager, make sure that depending on these shocks, you are as little as vulnerable as possible. Let's further deep dive into these two terms to better understand supply chain risk. When we talk about shocks, we actually have to acknowledge that the frequency of shocks is increasing. So that left illustration should give you a glimpse of the timeline where we mapped the shocks onto, and you might be able to see that the frequency is particularly higher in the most recent years. And there's different parts to it, right? So there's natural disasters, there's hurricanes, earthquakes, further hurricanes, fires. There's also political crisis, right? So if we think about Brexit or the crisis in Venezuela. There's also armed conflicts if we think about the Syrian civil war, as well as trade wars, right? And quite recently we've experienced the US-Chinese trade war, which heavily impacted also supply chains. And there is the pandemic of COVID-19 and further economic crisis, such as the 2008 recession. So yes, the frequency has increased. But what does that actually mean now to supply chains? We have to see, when it comes to the facts, that a 1 to 2 week disruption actually happens every 2 years. So it's not just a phenomena that happens every 10 years, right? So 1 or 2 weeks of a disruption every 2 weeks, 2 years. And a 1 to 2 month disruption even happens every 3.7 years. So it's actually quite massive. So let's prepare for these shocks. I just picked up that example. Every 3.7 years, you have a disruption that lasts at least 1 month. You could say, okay, so what? Well, the so what stands here. 45% of 1 year's EBITDA during a decade is lost. So there's significant economic damage associated with these shocks. So you should prepare basically your supply chain and understand what's the vulnerability where I can, you cannot really adjust the frequency of shocks, but you can prepare for these shocks and decrease the vulnerability. And that's where we're focusing on the next page. We see 7 different fields or areas where a supply chain or an organization in more general can be impacted, can be more or less vulnerable. So let's go through them just to get a bit better insight into these 7 areas for vulnerability. So let's start with regulatory and go then clockwise. With regulatory, what's the degree of oversight actually from the government? And what's the potential for change due to regulations? What's your ability to change when new regulations come in? Data security is probably very well discussed in these days. Cybersecurity, data protection, these fields, of course, are getting more and more important. Structural, I believe, is also a very interesting one. To what level are you exposed to any particular threats? Are you having any patterns in your organization, for example, which make you even more or less exposed to climate change, trade tensions? Is there specific patterns that make you more vulnerable? Organizational maturity. Do you have risk management capabilities in place? Do you have any changes in your organization which happened recently, which might make you a bit more vulnerable when changes come or shocks occur? Reputational, operational, financial, maybe to pick also on operational, of course, what's your supplier visibility? Do you have a good visibility into the supplier base or rather low one? What's your sourcing risk? Are you basing on single sourcing, or do we focus on multi-sourcing? Planning accuracy, manufacturing performance, all these areas, you might have a rather good or bad performance, which is then making you more or less vulnerable. Financially, if you have a rather high cash flow, you're pretty much less vulnerable to these shocks. Now we focused on the definition of supply chain risk. We focused on shocks, what shocks can exist, and what's the vulnerability of your organization. What happens basically when the shock comes in. We also talked about the impact and the cost associated to shocks. And we were saying it's actually quite significant, thinking about that 45% of EBITDA can be lost due to these shocks. Let's now go one step further and try to understand what can we do about it. I think that's the even more interesting piece, and I'll try to give you our perspective on that. These are a couple of questions which you might ask up front. For example, I pick on the first one. Are we measuring supply chain risk? So what we just defined, are we actually measuring that? And what assumption are we using when measuring and quantifying it? And to what extent actually does supply chain resilience really help us to be more competitive? Let's try to get some answers to this. What we prepared also for today is we conducted a survey this year, including more than 70 global supply chain leaders, in asking them how did COVID-19 impact their supply chain organizations and what measures they have taken in order to improve resilience of supply chains. And I would like to provide you with the results of that survey. On the left part, you see the 4 most prominent findings and common answers from these participants. They were actually saying that the vast majority was saying, 73%, there's a significant issue in my footprint. In my production footprint, supplier footprint, supply chain, whatsoever. Another big portion was saying there's issues considered with our planning processes. And quite significantly, 98% are saying we have a lack of talent and a lack of digital technologies. Because digital technologies don't help if you do not have the capabilities to work with them. And that is quite striking, that number. And close to 90% is also saying that overall supply chain resilience is actually low. and that need to be increased. Even more interesting, I believe, is what these global supply chain leaders have come up with in order to improve the current situation. And it's very interesting to give a couple of examples. So the vast majority is actually saying they increase the footprint resilience by really implementing a couple of very interesting levers. So what they did, for example, is increasing critical inventory. And yes, you could, of course, come up with saying, I increase my inventory overall in order to have more buffer for shocks to come in. But that would then have other consequences coming next to it, like inventory holding costs, working capital, etc. But you could do it on a segmented basis. You could pick out these business critical SKUs, the business critical items, and associate a higher service level to them. So just partially and very dedicated increase the inventory for these strategic items. Most of them also were saying that dual sourcing of raw materials is probably a very good idea. And a couple of more answers were nearshoring, regionalization of further opportunities which they looked into. Another very interesting field is that they all, or 80% of them, invested in digital planning capabilities to increase supply chain visibility end to end. And most of them, 85%, also were saying that they started to increase digital talent. So they invested in the tools and invested in the workforce, basically, in order to increase these digital capabilities in the organization by either reskilling already employed workforce or even acquiring new talent. And 95% is also very interesting action. We're saying that they proactively now manage supply chain risks by monitoring supplier risks and demand risks. So any variability which might kick in from supply or demand, which you want to tackle, which you want to build the resilience of your supply chain for. So I believe that survey had very interesting insights from which problems actually got surfaced by COVID-19 and how companies reacted to it in order to increase the resilience. What I would like to do now is to provide you with a very specific industry example where we see particular measures which are important to take in order to increase your resilience of supply chains. And that is consumer business. Before starting into what we believe companies should focus on in terms of how to increase resilience in supply chains, I would like to provide you with some context to consumer business. These CPG companies are basically constantly facing challenges from changes in the customer preference and behaviors. There's rising competition, and there's more need for end-to-end global supply chains, while maintaining low costs and trying to keep growth up. Therefore, what large CPG companies have been doing is acquiring fast-growing smaller businesses. In fact, between 2015 and 2018, 40% of the industry growth actually arose from these acquisitions. As you might imagine, companies then struggle, of course, in improving the productivity, optimizing supply chain costs, etc. In some cases, the acquisition costs even were higher than the analyzed savings from the synergies. But even in the cases where that calculation is in favor for the synergies savings, then of course you need to integrate your supply chains. You have different supply chains that need to be aggregated. And as we can imagine, that is really hard to get them to any efficiencies. So there's quite significant challenges for these CPG companies, and therefore we suggest 5 factors to particularly focus in order to increase the resilience for supply chains for these CPG companies. Which are those 5? So we suggest to be very, very fast and flexible to decrease the time between order and delivery. And you should have a very segmented view, as there are different requirements from the customers, different demand fulfilling requirements in different categories and different geographics. So that might vary from market to market. And this is probably a field which we do not really have to discuss, right? It's the talent and the technology which you should focus as well in order to make sure that you fulfill your customer demand. And this is the point about integration, which is particularly important for these CPG companies due to the heterogeneity of their supply chains from the acquisitions. So make sure that you have all these supply chains well integrated, ensuring that there's different customers choosing different channels, which you should then be able to fulfill. And all that, of course, as efficiently as possible, as there's a quite high pressure on efficiency in consumer products. So this is the fields what we suggest consumer companies have a particularly focus on. But let's also try to understand how these actions can be implemented in order to increase resilience. So what's the steps for implementation, or what's the areas for implementation that are absolutely required in order to increase resilience? And these are 4 areas, as we believe. Let's get through them. In order really to actualize and implement resilience, we see that you need to quantify it. And that links back to the first question which I showed up front. Should we measure supply chain risk? Yes, we should. We should measure it. We should implement and set up KPIs showing what's the risk and what's the associated cost to it. You should, of course, have a process in place. And what's very interesting here is we suggest to do supply chain stress tests. So there could be dedicated units in an organization dealing with supply chain risk even more than in the past. And they should then do the scenario analysis, trying to understand what could be the variability in supply and demand. And what's the effect then on the impact on the supply chains? And really stress testing it, so to say, right? What scenarios will we then have, and what would be the mitigation plan to come up with the result of each of these scenarios? And then again, tools and capability building. And of course, this helps if this can be done on an end-to-end view for supply chains. I'll go in more detail in a few minutes to this. It does not help if people do not believe in the concept. So that's why we suggest that there must be a common understanding across the organization through all levels. So that's why we need to invest in the awareness and the understanding of the topic. This we see as the 4 major areas which make you successful in actualizing and implementing resilience in the organization. Now I would like to become even more specific with some examples, so what we can particularly do. Let's just recap on this situation, just to be on the same page. So we're saying supply chain resilience is business critical. I think we all agree on that, and that's not a specific insight. With that number, though, in mind, this becomes even more vital, right? So where we're saying 45% of 1 year's earnings in a decade is threatened. What is striking, though, is actually that even though there's a quite significant hype on topics like machine learning and artificial intelligence, most organizations are actually not capable in applying these technologies. This is the current situation. So let's see what we can do about it. We would suggest that there should be innovative approaches in place, fused by digital technologies. But the tools alone will not be sufficient. You need the capabilities in order to apply them. You need the talent in order to work with these tools. And best case, and now I pick up the example of end-to-end again, this needs to be rolled out end-to-end, having an end-to-end visibility across the supply chain. This will then enable leaders, global leaders, in taking actions on a broader knowledge base as you have this end-to-end view. Eventually then, not only reducing supply chain risk, but also unlocking growth and new value. That could be our inspiration, not only reducing supply chain risk from shocks and vulnerability, but also increasing growth. If you manage to go through that journey and implementing digital capabilities. Some quite specific examples I just brought to also give some flavor and color to that a bit more abstract suggestion of how digital tools and capabilities need to be enhanced. So for example, what could be interesting is to have virtual reality glasses implemented. So what if you do maintenance across regions and there is a very capable and equipped person in Europe, which could do the maintenance for all the plants all over the world, but geographically, of course, that is limited. So what if that employee is equipped with these glasses so that he is virtually then standing in the plant in Asia or Americas and trying to assist the worker, the employee there, in how to repair the machine? That could be a very interesting lever, I believe. How about predictive analytics? In the last 3 years, I did a PhD on predictive analytics, focusing on the new era of predictive analytics in container shipping and air cargo. And what I focused on was working with machine learning algorithms, trying to understand if they can give some benefit, if they can increase forecast accuracy. And the answer is yes, there are significant improvements that you can achieve, which you might want to leverage. And then other examples are data intelligence, Industry 4.0, which I would like to pick up on the next slide. Because I'm saying there's two parts to it. And this is a bit repetitive now, but this is an important message I want to bring across. The one piece is the technology side itself. And there's all these buzzwords, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, etc. And yes, if you implement them correctly, then you can get to revealing growth and not just reducing supply chain risk. But you need adjustments and changes in the organization as well. For example, there could be new units which one have not had before, like predictive demand management, or end-to-end supply planning, really on an end-to-end level across all plants and business units across the world. Or data mastery, that all the data which is referred to supply chain is gathered in one unit, and they are then having all the capabilities with machine learning, etc. This is what I wanted to bring across on the topic of how to build resilience. Just to recap, we were saying COVID-19 actually revealed quite significant issues and challenges in global supply chains. But leaders in global supply chain roles have taken action, started to take action already. And these go in absolutely the right direction. It's about technology, digital tools, but also increasing the capabilities, the organizational changes, and having an improved supply chain risk management in place. Brings me to my last point. I wanted to provide you with a couple of examples where we jointly worked with our clients together in order to increase resilience in global supply chains. Specifically, I brought two examples, and this is what I would like to show you here is we managed to go through 3 steps, and this is very analytical based. So in the first one, we did some analysis on how could the demand variate compared to the forecasted demand. Let's do some simulations and see what could be the different demand scenarios, which we then, of course, need to prepare our supply chain for. And the same we did in a second step. We analyzed the supply risk. How about variability in the supply? What scenarios would that mean in addition to the demand variability scenarios? And then the third point is quite interesting, I believe. You would have a regularly happening resilience decision cycle, walking through these scenarios, adjusting the scenarios based on the actuals which come in, adjusting the forecasts, and then always trying to understand, is our supply chain prepared for these scenarios, or where do we have to come up with a mitigation plan where we feel that for this particular scenario, we're not prepared with our supply chain. As a result, we actually were able to come up with quite significant improvements for that client. We reduced even the total inventory by 50%, and we had no COVID-19 related supply disruption by today with that client. In addition, we reduced the share of single-sourced items by 5 percentage points, and we reduced 10 percentage points of dual production setups. Focusing on how we got here is, I think, the interesting piece. So really doing the scenario analysis, coming up with the simulations, and then really trying to understand, are we ready in terms of supply chain? As a last example, and this ties back to the vulnerability slide which I showed before. If there are certain structural risks, if you have a certain exposure, for example, due to a geographical pattern, then this was the case actually as we were concentrated in high-risk locations, very focused in these locations, and that had a significant risk then, of course, for the supply chain. What we did is exactly what I showed on the previous slide. We did the scenario analysis, assessing the risks and assessing mitigation plans, how we can overcome these risks. And we came up with an optimized footprint. As you can see, maybe also for the picture below, we suggested an adjusted picture, an adjusted footprint, which reduced the structural risk and ultimately reduced the vulnerability, which then was the essence in order to reduce the resilience, increase the resilience of supply chains. In effect, we were able to reduce costs, lead times, and even freeing up capital, cash flow, by simply, that was the major piece, by doing the scenario analysis, preparing our supply chain to become more resilient. This would be everything I wanted to show you and provide you with in terms of what's the fact base to resilience in supply chains, assessing supply chain risk and what's the impact, the economic impact to it, and then also providing with a couple of suggestions and examples how we believe that resilience can be enhanced. I hope you found it interesting, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Adrian, thank you so much for your very thought-provoking presentation. We have some questions which came in from our audience. I wonder if we could just go through those in the next few minutes.
Very happy to.
The first one is, how can companies increase supply chain resilience in digital planning, and how does this help to increase end-to-end supply chain visibility?
So when it comes to digital planning end-to-end, especially when focusing on end-to-end, it's absolutely vital that you connect the nodes, you connect the dots in your network. And this view, which you then increase, fueled by machine learning, fueled by digital solutions, that allows you to have more managerial implications. I give a specific example because that might sound a bit dry. So let's assume you are a basic material producer. Mm-hmm. You're based in Europe. That's where all your queries, your sources are, and you have business units all over the world, plants all over the world. The headquarters in Europe cannot have the full visibility if these nodes are not connected. All these plants and business units need to be connected with the headquarters. What I mean by that is, what information should headquarters have? They should probably have a very good visibility on what's the current inventory levels in these business units, in these plants. What's their production schedules, right? So what are they planning to do? Because once the order comes in at headquarters, it might be too late. They can only react. But what if you can anticipate these orders because you have this visibility now of these inventories and production schedules? So that is what I mean by end-to-end visibility. And that can only happen if you have these digital tools in place, right? And of course, then you need the capabilities again in Europe to, in this case, in headquarters, to deal with these tools. But that would be the visibility which can be particularly enhanced, connecting the nodes, collecting all the information, and then you have a better base for your judgment.
Thank you for that clear example. Let me move on to the next question.
Sure.
To what extent can machine learning and improved prediction capabilities help to increase supply chain resilience?
So what I found particularly interesting when I did my PhD on predictive analytics is that machine learning, as I mentioned before, actually has a massive potential to increase forecast accuracy, right? And why is that now linked to resilience in supply chains? What I mentioned up front, what shocks do exist? And there are two types of shocks that can be anticipated, but they can only be anticipated if you do the forecasting right? So if you have a higher forecast accuracy in place, fueled by machine learning technologies, then you have a better anticipation on these shocks, and you can prepare then your supply chains better as you better anticipate these shocks.
Thank you. One more time for one last question, I think.
Yes, of course.
Can you give us some practical examples in manufacturing and supply chain risk management that show how resilience can be increased?
Yes, of course. So supply chain risk management, I think that's an important and interesting piece. So probably in the past, companies have focused on assessing suppliers' risk, mostly on financial terms, right? So what's their financial health? And that mostly was then determining the wealth of the supplier and our risk, our supply risk. I think what could be suggested is that there should be dedicated units doing that supply chain risk management. And what should then be done? I think there could be more measures in place. For example, when we come to supplier risk, I think more factors should be considered. For example, geopolitical risks, social risks, that can all be added. We have, for example, a growing, emerging number of natural disasters, right? So that all can be implemented in this, we could call it a supplier risk assessing tool. And that, of course, can be enhanced again by digital technologies like machine learning. So that could be all done. So it's twofold the answer. Install these supply chain risk units and then bring in more factors in order to do the analysis and leverage machine learning or digital technologies. And just as a last comment, as you mentioned, also manufacturing, that's also interesting. When we, for example, think about maintenance in manufacturing, that is mostly done, and I've seen a lot of companies doing that on a regular basis in a very traditional way, going around the plant and taking their notes, understanding what's the current level, what's the health of the manufacturing plant. This is then only a snapshot because you do that once a month, once a week, I don't know. Why not doing this real time by robots or cobots that go around and check on a constant basis? This will reduce your costs, but also increase your level of security is the wrong word. You can be sure that you captured all the risks because it was captured real time. So that I could imagine that's another good example where digital technologies can help.
Fantastic, Adrian. Well, we will have to leave it there, but thank you so much for what I'm sure the delegates will have found a very useful and informative presentation.
Thanks so much again for the invitation.
Thank you.